All right, two important topics to be aware of when you are engaging with a client or even a group, but we'll talk about obviously individuals because we're in individuals and families. This is important during the whole entire relationship, but it often can come out while you're asking questions, and it's actually a good way to kind of bring out more data. It's these concepts of transference and countertransference. So they're very similar, just a little bit. They have one big difference between them. So we'll start with transference. And so transference is when the client projects or basically transfers feelings onto the social worker. This is typically unconscious. They're not always aware that they have the unresolved feelings or attitudes or conflicts that they're feeling and they're placing on the social worker. So the social worker's role is to kind of help the clients bring it to their conscience. So any strong emotional response or reaction the client has towards this social worker could be considered transference. So like developing romantic feelings for the social worker, overly identifying with the social worker, feeling like they're the same person or they're best friends, or getting irrationally angry at the social worker for what might seem like no reason or very minimal offenses that kind of like set the client off. Kind of having this magical thinking, putting their therapist or social worker on a pedestal and making them into something that they are not. And essentially, the thing to remember about transference, because this is what makes it different than countertransference, is it's the client perceiving or projecting their feelings or transferring their feelings towards the helper in a distorted way. And so, essentially, when we go into a therapeutic relationship with a client, it's kind of the therapist and social worker's role is to put on this appearance of a blank slate. Like we're coming in with that non-judgmental attitude. Acceptance, meeting the client where they're at. And so this allows the client to come in and bring whatever issues that they're experiencing, and we reflect it back. And so the clients can build insight into their functioning, how they're perceiving the world and everything. And so sometimes the danger with that blank slate is, and not necessarily danger, but where things can get interesting is then the client can create their own narrative about who you are and the role that you're playing in their life and in their therapy. So transference, remember, it's the client putting their feelings onto the social worker in an unconscious way. So some examples of transference are clients who make you into something or not. Often it's a miracle worker or their best friend, or maybe it's an elderly client and now they're identifying you as their grandchild. Number two is similar to kind of that superhero helper role, as they see you as a super person. They might expect more out of you than you realistically can do or shouldn't do in your role as a therapist. So this could be anything from like assuming that you can just fix all of their problems emotionally, or maybe they're like, well, you need to be able to answer my phone calls at all hours of the day because you're my therapist, I'm struggling, and you know I need you. A client might displace anger onto you. And so if they're frustrated with something, they might then transfer that anger onto you. Or clients who easily fall in love with you. This tends to be the main one that gets talked about with transference and countertransference because A, it's against the code of ethics, and B, you just don't have relationships with your clients. Just don't do it. But if you think about the context and kind of the nature of therapy, the therapist is coming in and asking their client to develop a level of emotional intimacy for them. And like intimacy in this situation isn't necessarily a bad thing because they have to be able to trust you. You might be one of the few people in their life who's ever listened to them or validated them. And in turn, that can be unconsciously interpreted by the client as, hey, this could be a romantic relationship. And so it's just natural. If somebody expresses care about you, you tend to think warmly about them. But the danger is when it starts to turn into something romantic, obviously that's something that could greatly impact the therapeutic relationship. And so here is the next one. So how do we manage it? What do we do when we're identifying it? I'm going to move that over a little bit. It's really okay to reflect the transference to the client. It's a really, really useful tool because it helps bring some of those unconscious things into the conscious forefront. And so an example would be if your client continues to apologize after, like, oh, they were a few minutes late, or they knocked over the box of tissues, or they don't think they gave you an answer fast enough. They're continuing to apologize over and over. And you've remembered that they had talked before that their mother always made them apologize. They felt this urge to apologize to her. So a reflection back would be like, hey, I noticed you're often very apologetic in sessions when you feel like you haven't said the right thing or done the right thing. And it's interesting because you've also mentioned that you've always had the need to apologize to your mom when you felt disappointed. I wonder if there's something about our relationship that reminds you of your mother. And so that invites them to either be like, oh yeah, no, not at all. Then you could reflect that back as, oh, well, maybe then I'm noticing that pattern. So going back to the previous movie, those patterns and the themes, that then you can take it down that path. But let's say like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. Like, you are a woman who's an authority, and so I just naturally feel like I have to apologize to you too as well. So then you can kind of process through and make steps to kind of work through some of those tendencies and urges. Has to be done tactfully. Like, obviously we've talked about it's all about delivery, kind of taking that kind of like humble posture and like, hey, I'm not sure, I'm wondering. It allows you to give the client space to determine if they want to acknowledge it instead of you telling them that this is what they're feeling. You got to be really careful with the romantic one. Obviously, if you are having a client express romantic interest in you, it does need to be addressed on some level because it's interfering to the therapeutic process. So whether it's you talk about it, you figure out a plan, you shut it down, tactfully, obviously, or if it's determined that the client just wouldn't be able to work with you in a healthy way, you would end the relationship, the therapeutic relationship. So I always go to supervision for that one. And that kind of goes to the second or the final one. Sometimes this needs to happen in supervision before exploring the ramifications with the transference with the client. I am not on my reading game today, and making sure it's appropriate to do so. So sometimes it might be further into the clinical relationship, so you have like established rapport with the client. You might be able to do it without supervision, but supervision can help you kind of navigate, like, is this transference? Is there any countertransference, which we're going to talk about later, to kind of help navigate keeping the client feeling safe and having a sense of trust, but at the same time making sure that we're providing good clinical services without these issues kind of clouding our judgment and our client's judgment. And so I think one of the examples that I have experienced had to do with anger. I had a client who felt we had worked, actually, this is our buddy who showed the inappropriate picture to me. I had worked with him for about 4 years at this time, so we had a very strongly established trusting relationship. But he knew I accepted him. He knew my character. He was really, he would often get very upset because he was African American, and he would talk a lot about discrimination and how he felt people perceived him because of his race, because of his mental illness, because of his lower socioeconomic status, all very valid things that he experienced and very much his reality. And he had never expressed any concerns that I was treating him in a manner that felt discriminatory or that I was being racist in some or had some biases. Like, in our 4 years, that had never come up. Well, he had he was, I forget even what he was talking about, but I kind of like gently reflected back because he was kind of being a little rascal, and he needed to be, to maybe like push him to think like, hey, maybe you could think of the situation a different way, or maybe you could have approached it differently. And so I was kind of like doing some reflections and reframes of the situations, and it made him mad because he didn't want to hear it and he didn't want to change. And so all of a sudden he became so angry at me, and started yelling at me and saying like, hi, I could never help him because of I will never be a Black male with mental illness, which is completely valid and true. I will never be able to understand that specific frame of reference because it's not mine. But it was just fascinating that he kind of transferred all of this anger about a different situation onto me, even though we had never had that issue. And maybe he had repressed it for 4 years. To me, it felt like more of this, like a kind of a defense mechanism for him and like distraction from the problem at hand, because it then led us to a different conversation and we didn't talk about the thing I was challenging him on. But he kind of transferred all of that anger he had on people not necessarily understanding him or feeling like he was always being challenged and he wasn't doing the right thing. He did that all on me based on my therapeutic challenge of his situation. And so we had to kind of pull back and talk about that and kind of work through it. And he never brought it up again. So that was like kind of a different way to look at transference besides just like those romantic relationships or like a mother, father, because that's often familial. So people will transfer their feelings about maybe their mom or their father onto you. But anger can be one as well because it reminds them of a different situation and projecting the anger onto you. So that's transference. I'm going to do part 2 for countertransference in the next video. Actually, I take that back. I forgot I had 2 more slides on transference. I thought I was done. So I want to give you ways to address and manage the transference, because once you identify it, you need to do something about it. You want to help clients process through the difference between themselves and their original object of their affection or feelings or whatever, and help reflect back like that previous example of like, hey, I noticed you felt the need to apologize to your mom, or you're apologizing to me. You also felt the need to apologize to your mother. And then if they say, yes, you do remind me of their mom, then it helps to kind of be like, okay, well, we're 2 separate different people. Like, let's talk about this. And so helping bring, again, that unconscious feeling into the forefront so you're able to process and maybe make changes to their patterns of thinking. It could be something as simple as like one mannerism that reminds them of their childhood friend or their mother or a teacher, or let's say like a perpetrator of abuse, because that can be a tricky one with transference too. You might have the same voice tone. You might wear the same perfume as somebody negative in your life. So that can prompt a transference. It has nothing to do with your personality or how you're acting, but something that's maybe a nonverbal can prompt some transference. And so discussing that. So maybe it is the perfume. So you stop wearing that perfume, and that really helps the situation. The more differences you can help them see between you and the original object of their feelings, the more they're able to scale down their feelings and enter back into like a healthy therapeutic relationship. And so this takes skill and this takes time, but you're going to want, and that's why supervision's good, but you're going to want to train yourself to look and be aware of transference from the beginning. And then finally, one of the best ways to address and manage transference is setting boundaries. Always keep in mind what the Code of Ethics says about dual relationships, not just necessarily sexual or romantic relationships, but just interactions with your clients outside of the therapeutic setting in general. Sometimes you might need to terminate the relationship early if the transference just becomes so therapeutically interfering and you can't figure out a way to overcome it. It is appropriate to terminate the relationship, but you have to make sure you terminate well. All right, that is everything on transference.